I'd like to thank Fingal County Council for inviting me to speak here yet again. They haven't wanted to get rid of me yet. I also would like to thank Fingal Archives and Local Studies. I've been researching there for the last 10 years. I wouldn't be able to talk or write or conduct any of the research without their help. The archives that we have here, we were lucky that when Dublin County Council split up, the archives for the whole of Dublin County Council happened to be north of the Liffey in Parnell Square. And when they divided everything out, Fingal got the archives. Other people got water treatment plants. So I'm happy that we have them here in Swords. And I have gone through them from the 1860s right through to 1950. So when Catherine says I'm an expert, I just happen to have read more than anybody else. Probably nobody else is as boring as wants to read that amount of local government records and minutes. I've given talks here as part of the Festival of History before on the period of the Revolution, on various years, Fingal in 1920, Fingal in 1921, and on the Civil War. I think at this stage, as we are at the end of the decade of commemorations, people are probably a little bit fatigued with guns and bullets. So most of my talk is going to be the period after the Civil War, from 1923, 1924, right up to 1930. When the expectations of people who had gone through 10 or 12 years of conflict, 10 or 12 years of deprivation, was going to yield what they had been promised. And I'll tell you whether what they were promised was actually delivered. This is a photograph of the main street in Swords. Some people will recognise it. I can't date it to the actual year, but I know from looking at the fact that we have telegraph poles and some of the cars that are there and the type of bikes that are there, it's around the late 1920s, early 1930s. So just to begin, what happened at the time of the treaty in Fingal? Well, Dublin County Council split straight down the middle after the treaty was signed. And at their very, very first meeting, this is the minutes, they decided not to have any vote. Some councils and some rural district councils around the country had decided that they would have a vote, they would debate the treaty, whether they would support it or oppose it. The chairman at the time, Henry Friel, copped on very, very quickly that it was going to be acrimonious, and they decided to adjourn almost immediately. The two TDs for Dublin County at the time, who were based in North County, were Frank Lawless and Jim or Michael MJ Derham from Balbriggan. They both voted for the treaty, as did the other prominent politician, Dr. Richard Hayes, who was by then a TD for Limerick, but who had fought with the Fingal Brigade in 1916. So, as happened in most parts of the country, whatever way the TDs voted, a lot of ex-IRA, a lot of Sinn Féin voted with their commanding officers. Whatever way they voted, they would have voted the same way. So Fingal ended up as largely pro-treaty at that time. Frank Lawless, who I've mentioned, was involved in politics. He was born around 1870, 1871. He was involved in local politics in the early years of the 20th century. He was a member of the IRB, he was a member of the GAA, a member of the Gaelic League. In those organisations, that's where he learned to conduct himself as a politician. But in my view, having studied him and having studied what he was doing, he was undoubtedly the leader of the nationalist political movement or Republican political movement from about 1914, when he was elected to the Board of Guardians in Balroddery, right through to his death in April 1922. He had been involved on various government committees of the provisional government after 1919. He died in an accident. His horse bolted and he had head injuries. His funeral in Colossery in April of 1922 was the last time that the leaders on both sides of the treaty, De Valera, Collins, Griffith, Brewer, were photographed together. He was undoubtedly a loss to Fingal and the Fingal area. When the Civil War broke out in June of, broke out as a violent conflict towards the end of June, when on the 28th of June the Four Courts was shelled, the battle for Dublin took place. It was over within 2 weeks. Initially, the fighting in Dublin City took place over maybe 3 or 4 days. It spread from the area around the Four Courts to O'Connell Street or Sackville Street, and that's where Cathal Brewer was killed. On the 5th of August, an incident called the Night of the Bridges took place, and over 40 IRA officers, anti-treaty IRA officers, were arrested. They were attempting to blow up all the bridges into Dublin on the canals. They also attempted to blow up the aqueduct at Malahide. Because they were all captured, the Civil War effectively ended in Dublin at that time. And there was very little happened after that in Fingal for the remainder of the Civil War, through to when it kind of petered out. It didn't end on a particular day. So by the end of 1923, it was effectively over. What was the reality of the Civil War in Fingal? Well, if there was no fighting, there was certainly problems, because money was being spent on guns. It was being spent on, as Molly Adrian said, slinging printer's ink and spending all of our money on bullets and mines. The Free State Army, the National Army, it grew to something in the region of 40 or 50,000 soldiers. To conduct a civil war required money. You're also looking at a period when, coming out of a decade of conflict, Fingal, like the rest of the country, was starved of investment. It was starved of government grants. If you look at what was happening to the roads around Fingal between 1919 and 1921, and again 21-22, the IRA were blowing up the roads. Who was responsible for the repair of the roads? Dublin County Council. Where did Dublin County Council get their money? From the rates. Who paid the rates? The citizens. If Crossley tenders were going around the country and tearing up the roads, and the roads needed repair, who was responsible for repairing the roads? Dublin County Council, or its subsidiaries, in our case Balrodary Rural District Council and North Dublin Rural District Council. Who paid? The ratepayers. Who were the ratepayers? The citizens. So there was pressure all the time. If roads had to be repaired, it meant, and I know there's some people here who've been involved in local government in the past, and one of the main requirements is you balance the books. So if money is going into the repair of roads and the repair of buildings, well then it has to come from somewhere else. And that has a knock-on effect for people. There was a local government inquiry into expenditure in May of 1923, and Balrodary Board of Guardians and Balrodary District Councillors were all called to account for themselves. And most of that inquiry was to do with money that was being diverted into welfare and into outdoor relief, which the government disagreed with. And I'm going to explain the government's position now in a moment. Patrick Matthews, who was a member of the Labour Party, was quite proud that Balrodary Rural District Council was the only Labour council, as he called it, in 1920 in the local government elections. Sinn Féin won all of the councils in the 26 counties, the rural district councils. Only one of them was not completely Sinn Féin controlled, and that was Balrodary, which was 50-50 controlled by Labour and Sinn Féin. Christopher Brown, who fought in 1916, said at that inquiry, we fought for 3 years and we fought for nothing. People were feeling the pinch in 1923. James Woods, who also fought in 1916 with the Fingal Brigade, had spent time in Ballykinler. It meant he wasn't working. As one of the members of the Board of Guardians, he had to apply for relief for his family. And he didn't get it because as a guardian he was barred from applying for relief. So his family were suffering at that time. There was an increase in back to the land meetings. We know about the agitation in the 1870s and 1880s for land and for rights for tenants. That was still going on. There was land that would have been transferred under the Land Acts, and particularly after the Wyndham Act in 1903. But the landless never got land. The labourers never got land. So they were now starting to look for their dividend from the revolution for the sacrifices they had made. In the 1923 general election, James Derham was the only local TD that was elected. He died in an accident in his house in Balbriggan. He fell down the stairs in November 1923. That left no locally based TDs in the North County. And that had a big effect through the 1920s, because the system of government that we had in Ireland was very clientelist. If you didn't have somebody fighting for your rights or with a voice at any of we'll call it the big tables, we'll call it Dáil Éireann or on any committees or in government, your voice effectively wasn't heard. Here are 3 quotes that give an insight into the government's attitude to the poor around this time. These weren't easy to find, but I have them all in writing. And the language that's used and the attitude that's there tells us an awful lot about how and why people experienced what they did in Fingal in the 1920s. William T. Cosgrave wrote to Austin Snack in May of 1921. This is even before the Civil War. People reared in workhouses are no great acquisition to human society. As a rule, their highest aim is to live at the expense of the ratepayers. That is very much a Victorian attitude, not alone to the poor, but what's deemed to be the undeserving poor. Kevin O'Higgins famously said in the Dáil, "I think we were probably the most conservative-minded revolutionaries that ever put through a successful revolution." And James Aloysius Burke, who was Minister for Local Government in 1924, during the debates over the old age pension, and some of you will be aware that a shilling was taken off the old age pension, the number of people who lead a parasitic existence was increasing relative to the number of people who were striving to make an honest living. A lot of the inquiries that happened in Balroddery were to do with welfare being given. The history that I have studied of the poor law unions, of rural district councils, has been one where, beginning in 1838, as the providers of welfare for the destitute through the workhouses, they developed into the beginnings of the organs and the institutions of local government that we know today. They would have been developed in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s, as they increasingly took on responsibilities for what we now know as local authority responsibilities. The 1898 Local Government Act put that in place as county councils with subsidiary rural district councils. The Irish under British rule were very, very good, as were their nationalist local politicians, in working out how to get the most out of the British government. It happened with pensions, it happened with grants, but as soon as we were an independent state, the government that was in place decided no more. It was all right doing that to the British. This is our money. But we were always paying rates, we were always paying taxes. So we were effectively paying for that anyway the whole time. So let's move on to 1924 and start to look at what were the dynamics of local politics and local life. And politics reflects life. What happens in local politics is what's happening in people's everyday lives. The local councils that were elected in 1920 saw themselves as part of the vanguard of the revolutionary movement. And yes, they were, because we could not have transferred power without having control of the reins of local government. Even the diversion of the rates in 1920 and 1921 was a significant factor in bringing the British government to the negotiation table in late 1921. But by 1924, the new government had started to change. William T. Cosgrave had transferred 20,000 civil servants who were Crown civil servants before 1921 straight through to the new Irish administration. Their views would have been, in a lot of cases, the same views as were there under British rule. E.P. McCarran, Edward P. McCarran, was a career civil servant, and in January of 1924, he sent quite a strict directive in relation to Dublin County Council and to Balroddery in relation to the collection of rates, which were long, long overdue, to cost cutting and to expenditure. He was Secretary of the Department of Local Government at this stage, and he took a particular interest in one man in particular, James Vincent Lawless, a brother of Frank Lawless, and James Vincent Lawless had fought in 1916. He was incarcerated after that. He was in and out of prison a number of times. He led a hunger strike in Belfast jail. He was beaten up by the authorities on a number of occasions. He was, however, Secretary of Dublin County Council. He was elected in 1920 to Dublin City Council. And one of the things he did was he went through all the motor tax records in Dublin City Council, and he provided information on vehicles being used by Crown forces to the IRA. He also, while he was with Dublin City Council, identified where all the telephone lines were in Dublin, particularly the underground ones, and passed that information to Michael Collins. He reported directly to Collins when he was doing that. So he had a record as a revolutionary that was, in terms of being second to none. His son, Kevin Lawless, was appointed a junior clerk in late 1923, and McCarran objected. Now, why the Secretary of the Department of Local Government would be taking that level of interest would lead me to think that there's a personal animosity that's there. There was history with Edward McCarran in relation to Frank Lawless and in relation to other members of Balroddery Rural District Council, where he had targeted them during 1916 and later during the War of Independence. P.J. Curran, who was a councillor from Balbriggan, Labour member, he objected to what was happening in terms of the amalgamation of the Dublin unions, and he referred it to a whole list of Seamuses, Seans and Pauricks. These were the names of the local government inspectors who were sent out to Balroddery to object to expenditure, but were now the new commissioners of the Dublin Union, rather than having the North Dublin Union and South Dublin Union boards of guardians with guardians. There was also Mrs. Power, who was one of the commissioners. She was an aunt of Richard Mulcahy, and he objected to that and said that it was just blatant jobbery. The problems were not just with Dublin County Council and Balroddery. Dublin City Council, Dublin Corporation as it was then, was dissolved in 1924 and replaced by commissioners. And that continued up until 1930. Hence, the local elections in 1924 were postponed. And I've already said, with the death of MJ Derham, there was no voice in the National Parliament, but there was constantly attention on local government. Local government had more or less, in terms of the councils, developed into a ratepayers versus anti-government. The ratepayers represented the businessmen of Dublin, or the ratepayers group on the council, and the strong farmers. They always were looking for value for money for the rates that they were paying. And the anti-government group, which was anti-Cumann na nGaedheal, but also anti that particular group. One of the things my research, and particularly in my PhD, which I finished a couple of years ago, is through this whole period, there is a class war And we don't recognise sometimes that there's a class war at this time. We have always been given a narrative of us against them, meaning the Irish against the English, meaning nationalists against unionists. And yet, my research indicates that this is there all the time. The rates question became the new land question. So instead of looking for tenant rights, it was the rights of farmers, that they were paying rates, that the rates were too high. Now, under the British government, there were grants, there were rebates on agricultural rates. Now, I don't want to go in on a Saturday morning to the whole area of rates and how rates work, because it would bore the pants off everybody. But literally, rates is a tax, and it's a tax on property. And sometimes that tax on property, particularly agricultural property, if prices are depressed, can be problematic. Skerry's town tenants who had been bypassed in the Land Acts were looking to buy their houses from their landlord, and one landlord owned the whole of the town of Skerry's, that was Lord Homepatrick, and he kept holding out. He was looking for a higher price. They were looking for government grants to allow them to buy. The one core group from the 1870s right through to the 1950s that is consistent in Fingal is the County Dublin Farmers Association. They get into every farmers' organisation and every political organisation, almost like a small caucus. They keep coming up again and again. Two of their leaders at this time, who are again calling for reductions in rates, were P.J. Kettle, a nephew of Andrew Kettle and a cousin of Tom Kettle, and Edward Rooney. Edward Rooney had fought in 1916. His brother John Rooney was the Farmers' Party, had been the Farmers' Party TD for a year in 1921, and their father had been one of the first councillors from this area. They're from Raheny and Lusk, who was elected to Dublin County Council. Andrew Mooney, who had been involved in tenants' rights organisations around the Knoll and Garristown since the 1870s and was still alive, instituted a no rates campaign around Knoll. Again, all of this agitation only served to bring the attention of E.P. McCarran and the Department of Local Government constantly onto North County Dublin. The Local Government Act in 1925, which was intended to rationalise structures, to bring greater focus and accountability, to deliver greater continuity and effectiveness and efficiency to local government, was passed, but Dublin was left out. They didn't have new structures planned or new structures in place for Dublin. So Dublin was delayed to 1930, but in the case of Balroddery, it was an effective dissolution, because gradually various different responsibilities were taken away. And some of them you would think, that's only small. They took responsibility for libraries away. They took responsibility for other services away. So you had a rural district council that really had nothing to do. They were abolished in the rest of the country and were replaced by boards of health and boards of assistance. The boards of health and the boards of assistance are really the beginnings of what became later the Department of Health. There was no Department of Health in 1924. There was no Department of Social Welfare as it became. Those departments were not formed until much, much later. The Department of Health, or Public Health, was added on to local government in the 1920s. So these are the changes that are taking place. In the 1925 local elections, the turnout was abysmal. It's in some senses not surprising. People will be reading the newspapers and they see various local politicians at this time that would have been bickering. It would have been ratepayers and farmers as opposed to workers, and they were always pitched against each other. They'd also gone through the period of the decade of conflict. They'd gone through the First World War. But equally, they had gone through a series of elections. People had gone to the polls in 1918 for a general election. There hadn't been one since 1910. A local election in 1920. And they would have voted for both Balroddery and Dublin County Councils. There was a general election in 1921, a general election in 1922, a general election in 1923. People were fed up with elections. They were fed up with politics, and they tended not to vote. The ratepayers controlled Dublin County Council then by 2-1. And one of the reasons for that was because the former townships, Rathmines, Pembroke, Kingstown, Dunleary, Blackrock, Ballybrack, Dalkey, Killiney were all part of Dublin County Council. They were a very, very different cohort of citizens and of politicians to the farmers and workers of North County Dublin. There were 6 elected from the North County area of 23. In 1898, 1/3 of all the councillors that were elected were from the North County area, and their voice was heard in the early years of the 20th century. However, and I've said how powerful the farming lobby was in North County Dublin, they got half of the members on the County Dublin Agricultural Committee, which is what they were interested in, and they got 5 further people from the North County co-opted. So their interests were heard at that particular level. Those that were elected included Patrick Belton. Paddy Belton is famous. He built most of the houses around Donnycarney. That would have been called Drumcondra at the time, would have been part of Drumcondra. He was an independent farmer. Throughout the period that I've studied Paddy Belton, he has represented every single party except Labour. PJ Curran was elected for Labour. Coote Healy Hutchinson, who had been a British Army officer, involved heavily in recruiting, lived at Seafield House. It was either Seafield House or Lisson Hall. They had 2 of those houses. He was probably Lisson Hall, representing the ratepayers, an ex-unionist. Edward Rooney, who had fought in 1916, but from a strong farming background, also representing the ratepayers. Joseph A. O'Neill, as chairman of North Dublin Rural District Council, was an ex-officio. He was an ex-supporter of the Irish Parliamentary Party and the Home Rule movement. He was a son of Joseph O'Neill. Joseph O'Neill was chairman of North Dublin Rural District Council for 20 years. His uncle PJ was chairman of Dublin County Council for 20 years. So he had a very, very strong political pedigree. Thomas Smith from Donabate was chairman of Balroddery Rural District Council. He had previously been Dublin County Councillor. These are people coming back. These are people who we didn't necessarily see during the War of Independence and the Civil War, who are now back in local politics. Their influence restored. In Balroddery, Colm Lawless, son of Frank, who was actually sent home in 1916 because he was too young, was elected together with a independent Republican, PJ Fogarty. Fogarty becomes more important in the 1930s and 1940s. They represented Swords. It was a Senate election, the first time, and probably the only time the Senate was elected by popular franchise. Richard A. Butler from Pope's Hall and Skerries was president of the Irish Farmers Union. He had also been a past chairman of Balroddery Rural District Council. He lost his seat, but it was kind of sweetened a little bit because he was giving a role on the Prices Tribunal a year later in 1926. So you have the same people moving around in various different institutions, various committees, so that they still have a say. J.P. Cuff, a local auctioneer here, he was eliminated on the 35th count, and John Coonahan from Cumminganaile, who originally a Kerryman, then had a farm in Kildare and later moved to North County Dublin. He was a major grazier and cattle dealer. He was elected, and he was the only voice, and yet he represented cattle dealers. He represented that industry in the Senate. He didn't represent the local area. Andrew Jemison was also there, but Andrew Jemison was living in Sutton Castle. Some of you will know every opportunity I get to mention Sutton Castle and Andrew Jemison, I do, because that's where my wedding reception was held many, many years ago. But continuity in local politics. The same interests and the same families and the same people, even if they had their heads down during the revolution, they were back, and now they were having a say. The most important theme, the most important factor in the 1920s in Fingal is that of unemployment, is that of poverty. What the New Ireland meant was economic stagnation for almost everybody, and unemployment and poverty for most that were here. You had what was happening in terms of developments in agriculture, developments in farming. You'd moved away from tillage. You'd moved away from labour-intensive farming. It pitted local politics around both sides of that coin. You had PJ Curran, who you'll see there on the top right, and his ally PJ Fogarty on the side of the workers, all the time looking for welfare reliefs against Paddy Belton and the ratepayers, who were looking for reductions in rates for farmers. There was little common ground between them. In the winters of 1925-26 and 1926-27, prices fell due to an economic depression. There was rising unemployment. The solution for local councils was always road building. The roadmen were, you had people who worked for the council, and then you had temporary staff. So in the run-up to Christmas almost every year, and this had been happening for 20 or 30 years prior to this, there would be grants made available for people to work on the roads so that they would have work during the harshest months of the winter. There was a problem in Fingal. You could get grants for main roads, but you had to pay for the repair and upkeep and maintenance of local roads yourself. There wasn't enough money to do that. There wasn't enough money to take on as many men as were needed. They even decided at one stage only one man per family could work on the roads, because if you had two or three, it meant that there was two other men who didn't get work. There was also cliques. There was also who knew who. So this was very, very contentious in the 1920s, who got to work on the roads. There was even at one stage serious objections to council workers having overtime that could have been shared out among unemployed agricultural workers. At one stage it gets particularly bad. I'll come to that again. In February of 1926, Balrodgery Rural District councillors actually invoked Section 2 of the 1847 Poor Law Act. In independent Ireland in 1926, they were calling on legislation that was designed to help the poor in the worst year of the famine. That's how bad things were in the 1920s. There was unemployed men who walked out to the workhouse in Balrodgery every time there was a meeting to look for assistance. And they were told, the rules are the rules. We can't give you that because you're able-bodied. You have to report to the Dublin Union, i.e. the South Dublin Union. One man who fought in 1916 said, we went there in 1916, now you're sending us there again. And there was fighting in the South Dublin Union. Local government inspectors dismissed every appeal from Balrodgery. PJ Fogarty is on record as saying there will be a revolution in this country like there is in Poland, where men are slowly starving to death. And Thomas Smith, who was a government supporter, who couldn't get any answers out of Merrion Street and where the Department of Local Government were, referred to them as Mussolini's and Primo de Rivera's. Primo de Rivera was a dictator, military dictator in Spain at the time. So the councillors know what's happening around Europe, and they're comparing the revolutions that are going on in the early 1920s. And the fact that you have government supporters coming out with language like this is an indication of some of the desperation. Now, I've been talking about unemployment and poverty. Add to that what's happening in everybody's daily lives and the moral panics. a succession of moral panics. If you work through the newspapers in the 1920s, you see this happening. The evils of prostitution, the clearing of Monto by the Legion of Mary, illegitimacy, the filling of mother and child homes, juvenile delinquency, the filling of reformatories and industrial schools, sexually transmitted diseases. The British were gone. The Catholic Church for years had blamed sexually transmitted diseases, syphilis and gonorrhea, on the British Army. And undoubtedly, and I've done research on this, for instance, during the time of the famine, 1 in 3 British soldiers based in Dublin, of 6,000 British soldiers, had syphilis. It was a big problem in the British Army, but it was also a big problem in Ireland. Sexual abuse, domestic abuse, these keep cropping up. Destitution, child neglect, alcoholism. In 1923, there was 1 pub for every 200 people in Ireland. Just think about that. And think about how people are drawn to drink. Cinema, English books, English literature, smutty English newspapers like the News of the World. And the evils of that are constantly coming up in the newspapers. Music, dance, fashion. You've all seen photographs of around 1916. You've seen Countess Markievicz or Helena Maloney or Kathleen Lynn and coming them on and their long skirts. How short were skirts in the 1920s? And what that means in terms of moral panics. The evils of jazz, the evils of music, women with short hair. All of this is seen as threats. So you have a really conservative government who are in a kind of almost a siege mentality from the Civil War and beyond with the church. Emigration continues. There was up to 20,000, between 17 and 20,000 people left every year between 1926 and 1936. And when the Great Depression closed off the United States in 1930, more and more people went to Britain. So it was still continuing. That is the backdrop in terms of everyday lives and what people are looking at. It led to a proliferation of devotional organisations. Men's and women's sodalities were everywhere. The Legion of Mary, who, by the way, did phenomenal work in terms of closing down Monto. You had the Pioneer Total Abstinence Association. You had a dilemma in people's lives. You had this kind of enforced piety publicly, and then we'll all go to the pub afterwards and go to a dance. So you had that kind of dichotomy of what people were trying to do in the 1920s. Edward McCarran interfered again. The responsibility for water schemes lay with the local councils. He took delegations from Skerries and Balbriggan who wanted new water schemes, and he said, you have my approval to go ahead. Balrodry Rural District Council had voted against it because they took the view, why should everybody, including rural ratepayers, be paying for water schemes that only apply to Skerries and Balbriggan? Balbriggan had a town council. Balbriggan's big enough to be a UDC like Howth. Let them become a UDC, raise their own money and do it. There had been a row in the 1870s and 1880s in relation to the water scheme in Malahide that went on for the best part of 30 years, led by Andrew Kettle and the O'Neill cousins, over who should pay for water. Now, we've had those questions in the last few years, who should pay for water. They're as old as the 1870s. Who should pay for what and what they get. Balrodry Rural District Council couldn't get loans. 8 banks refused them in 1926. And each one of them said, you have to go to the National Bank. That's your nominated bank, the National Land Bank, which was the government bank. So the banks were being told by the government, don't give them a loan, send them to the National Bank. The scandal in 1926 was that the National Land Bank was charging Balrodry Council interest on its loan repayments but was not paying interest on its deposits. How kind of obvious is that in terms of an attempt to undermine local government? In the 1926 by-election, Darrell Figgis died. William Norton was elected. Paddy Belton had run and polled quite well. He brought up the Balbriggan hosiery factory, the one, Deeds and Templar, that was burnt down in 1920. It was never rebuilt. Michael Collins promised he would rebuild it. Kevin O'Higgins said Collins never said any such thing. Paddy Belton, during that campaign, said that government could resettle Mayo men and Meath, but couldn't build a factory in Balbriggan. And that's to do with Rathcarn and the provision of land for people from the west of Ireland. So the tensions that are there are palpable. Also in 1926, the Local Appointments Commission was set up. That took the ability to appoint their own staff away from local councils. And also they brought in combined purchasing. O'Higgins had sent out a directive saying that the reason for this legislation was due to nepotism, log rolling and corruption in the matter of public appointments. And Dublin County Council took specific umbrance at that being levelled at them. He later went back and said he didn't just mean them, he meant everybody. Log rolling, by the way, is an American expression for corruption. McCarran took a particular interest then when Frank Lawless's daughter Nuala was appointed as a junior typist with Dublin County Council, and he objected to her getting that job. Paddy Belton said if her father hadn't lost all his money fighting for Ireland, she wouldn't have needed to get a job. So the animosity is still there. He also objected to James Lawless's salary, which at this time was £1,100 a year, at a time when you had the levels of poverty. That'd show you that not everybody is completely white, not everybody is completely blameless. So that's one of the things that you do learn when you look at history in this detail. The 1927 election, again, this is quite illuminating in terms of Paddy Belton. At the beginning of the election, he ran as an independent candidate. By the time of the election, he was Fianna Fáil. He was elected for Fianna Fáil. He got about a 12th of the vote here. He called himself, and I love this one, the Walking Labour Exchange, the friend of the country roadmen. He was a man who would be all things to all men as long as you gave him your vote. So if you needed this, he'd back you. If you needed that, he'd back you as long as you vote for me. I think we've seen people like that since then. And he, as I said before, he went through every party. But Patrick Belton's main objective was always Patrick Belton and his class, which was the strong farmer. He said he'd only stay in public life till he drove out the reptiles, O'Higgins and Cumann Gael government. And he said, and this is a famous one as well, that a vote for Cumann Gael was a vote for Paddy Hogan's Bullock policy and nothing for the people but the emigrant ship. The move, the Irish economy in the 1920s was built on livestock, cattle and cattle exports to Britain. And it was booming. And everything else in terms of economic policy was agricultural policy. Everything else changed. When he was elected in June of 1927, Fianna Fáil returned 44 TDs. Cumann Gael almost were beaten, but weren't. There was 47 Cumann Gael, and Cosgrave was narrowly re-elected. But immediately afterwards, within a few days, on the 10th of July, Kevin O'Higgins was assassinated, walking either to or from Mass in Booterstown near his home. Immediately, there was an outcry. Public Safety Act was passed. Now, one of the clauses in the Public Safety Act and associated legislation related to making it an offence to be associated with the non-payment of annuities. And this was a red rag to somebody like Patrick Belton. So he entered the Dáil before Fianna Fáil did, so that he could exercise his vote to vote against that, and he was duly expelled from Fianna Fáil. Although he claims that De Valera was withering and doddering on that particular policy. But the Public Safety Act also made it difficult for Fianna Fáil to stay out of the Dáil. They had to take their seats or they would be debarred. So they entered the Dáil on the 11th of August, but not with Patrick Belton as a member of Fianna Fáil. In the by-election on the 14th of August, Gearóid O'Sullivan, who had been a member of Collins' squad, was elected in place of Kevin O'Higgins. And they got, I think, 56% of the vote in North County Dublin voted for Gearóid O'Sullivan. Cosgrave survived by a single vote then. There was a no confidence vote from Labour, and famously John Jinks didn't turn up and he was on the train back to Sligo. The insinuation that he'd been employed full of beer, and they put him on and he didn't vote, and that was the difference. Cosgrave immediately called a snap by-election, and following the death of O'Higgins, they gained 15 seats and they had yet again a comfortable majority. Come back to Dublin County Council again, and it is still about income versus expenditure. It is still about paying for services, paying for welfare, or the rates. Balroddery were suspended in 1929 because they refused to carry out any works on national roads. Edward Rooney called them railways for buses. He said the railways are responsible for the upkeep of the track, but bus companies are not responsible for the upkeep of the roads. And he also said the roads in North County Dublin serve nothing other than a race track for people going between Dublin and Belfast. So we were paying for the major roads, which should have been the responsibility of government. When they were dissolved or suspended, commissioners were brought in. They put out tenders for the roads. Nobody from North County Dublin tendered. So you could see that there was, even though people needed work, there was still a solidarity there. Eventually there was negotiations. They won a facile victory, but the council was abolished in 1930 anyway under new legislation. And actually the last chairman of Balroddery Rural District Council was actually Colm Lawless. In the year ending 31st of March 1927, because we have to look at numbers as well, there were 44 persons per 100,000 in Balroddery on home assistance who were receiving welfare relief, compared to a national average of 18 per 100,000. That's over twice as many. So that gives you an idea of the continuing economic depression that is here. Families were going, and I showed you a photograph earlier from the 1930s of Balroddery Workhouse. It was disused, it was abandoned. It had been wrecked in 1920 by the British Army, not by the backhand hands, by the British Army, and wasn't used since then. But people were homeless. They were actually going and saying, can we rent a room in the workhouse? It was literally that bad. The Board of Works refused housing loans because they said the only expenditure that was approved was on public health spending. Thomas L. Smith said, if you saw some of the homes that people are living in North County Dublin and their sanitation, this is a public health issue. In the early 1920s, Dublin City Council, Dublin Corporation, was only building 457 houses on average a year. And we all know the population of Dublin. So the 1920s were not a nice place. I'm going to talk now just about an incident that happened in 1929 that actually tells us about how Ireland hadn't changed at all. And it's the case of Mrs. Menton and Hilltown Farm. Her farm was called Hilltop, but it was in Hilltown. Some of you may know where Hilltown is, if anybody's from Swords. It's in River Valley. This exploded in the newspapers. PJ Kettle and JP Cuff were writing. The background is that the Irish Farmers Union was effectively representing strong farmers. And there was other smaller groups, the Agricultural League representing smallholders, the Farmers Protection Association calling for derating, the Irish Farmers Federation. There was a whole plethora of farming groups around that time. But when this went to the papers, it was that Mrs. Menton, who they said had a 150-acre farm in that area, was being evicted. She was a widow and being evicted with her 9 children. And they went to town on it. PJ Kettle and Paddy Belton called a meeting. There was people brought to the farm who were going to plough up the land rather than it being given to anybody else. It was being stoled. It was part of the Staples estate. Staples was a absentee landlord, and it was being sold under the 1923 Land Act. Mrs. Menton wasn't all that she appeared to be. This is a photograph actually of the meeting on the farm, and they were going to plough up the ground. Now, her next door neighbour was Harry Usher. Harry Usher lived in Brackenstown House. He was originally from Galway, but he was a very successful horse trainer, racehorse trainer. And he had gallops nearby, but not on that land. He was a distant relative of the Molesworth family who built the original Brackenstown house, which burnt in 1913. So he was living in the one that was rebuilt. For anybody who's from Swords, this is at the western end of the Jacko or the Ward River Valley Park. He employed local men. He paid about £4,000 in wages to those who worked at his racing establishment. And in truth, there was probably about 200 acres that Mrs. Menton was farming. However, the other side of the coin, Mrs. Menton didn't live in Hilltown. She lived in a big house in Queen Street in Dublin. Her 9 children, 8 of them went to fee-paying boarding schools. The 2 boys went to the prestigious Clongowes College in County Kildare. Her husband had died in 1925, William Menton. His father, who died in 1901, had left him in his will £5,500, which is about 400,000 minimum in today's money. Dennis Menton had been the main supplier from as early as 1883 to the North Dublin Union and South Dublin Union workhouses as their main milk supplier. So all the rhetoric of the Land League, the 3 Fs, evictions of widows with 9 children, who are all in private fee-paying schools. There's 2 sides to what was going on. And it was appropriated by Belton and PJ Kettle and JP Cuff at the time for their ends in relation to derating and in relation to other issues like tariffs. So we're seeing something that's happening. I'll show you where it is. If you look here, this is a map from the 1850s of Hilltown. We have the original Brackenstown house, the Jacko Park for anybody, and the Ward River Valley Park, the river going through it. Swords people will know what I'm talking about. But this was all land that was leased by the Bowden family. So Patrick Bowden and then William Bowden later on. And she had most of it. This is where it is today. So where Aldi and the shopping centre is, so it's roughly half the Jacko and Fingal, Hilltown, where St. Finian's Church is. So you're talking about a very, very significant amount of land. I just have another detail, I'm just going to read it here from this. At the end of this, there was actually quite a humorous end to it. I couldn't find anything after the initial incident, which would lead me to think that the whole thing was manufactured by the farmers' organisations. There was no resolution. Mrs. Menton had already got £7,000 worth of loans under the Land Acts. Under the 1923 Land Act, there was a cap of 3,000. She would have got 3,000 worth of that land, but she refused. She wanted the whole lot. She was offered 4,500 compensation for giving up the land. She also refused. I found nothing after this in the newspapers, so I wasn't sure whether it was resolved or not. Eventually, after a lot of digging in the newspapers, I found a reference that the hunt went through Mrs. Menton's farm in 1934. So she was still there in 1934. And then I went into the valuation office and I went through all the revision books up to the 1950s. She died in 1956, and she still had possession of it up to 1956 when she died. So there you have the rhetoric of the past still being used again. But somebody wrote a letter into the Drogheda Independent at the end of it and signed it as Rosa Dartle. Now, if any of you read Charles Dickens, Rosa Dartle was a character in David Copperfield, an orphan who asked awkward questions and kept asking awkward questions. And at the end of, let's say, what was going on, she wrote, signed Rosa Dartle to PJ Kettle. What was the size of the farm holding in the dispute? And what were the other Menton holdings? She also had 100 acres in Drumcondra, adjacent to Paddy Belton. What about the attempt by the agitators to overturn the legal decision of the land commissioners? What about the 600-acre farms that the agitators, people like Kettle, people like Belton, people like Cuff, held themselves, and the accusation that Usher was looking for a mere 16 of the 270 acres that was in total for sale or redistribution? Do you want to scare Harry Usher into taking his business to the Curragh and £4,000 of wages to be sacrificed? To me, it just encapsulates a lot of what was happening, that you had those who could were able to agitate, and those who couldn't were literally left in the throes of unemployment or poverty. This continued then in 1929, 1930, 1931. And we see the building up here of a lot of the issues that were taken on by Fianna Fáil and proved to be successful issues in the 1932 election. There was always from 1923, from the beginning of Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland state, a 75% relief on agricultural rates. That was abolished in 1928. That meant that those farmers in Northern Ireland were at an advantage in relation to potentially exporting to the rest of the UK, where a lot of the Irish livestock was destined. There was constant calls for derating. By this stage, Richard Mulcahy was Minister for Local Government, and he said the same farmers have been going on for years and years. If they paid more attention to their business than they did about agitating, they'd be much better off. And it even brought William T. Cosgrave to actually write a piece himself on derating. 70% of the land in Ireland was agricultural land. If it was derated at that point or any point in the 1920s, the whole tax system probably would have collapsed. I'm almost at the end. The saga, the ongoing animus between James Lawless and E.P. McCarran came to a head in 1929 when charges were brought against James Lawless, allegedly for embezzlement and fraudulent conversion. And he resigned his position. And it all related to a practice before 1923 where the Secretary of the County Council took on an additional task of preparing the voters' registers, and he would have sent in his expenses for doing that. It was an extra job, you might call it a perk, and that was always paid under British rule. But there was about £1,500 that allegedly was not paid over, that was supposed to be due to the council. And James Lawless said this was always the practice, but there was never any hard and fast rules. And he was brought to court. The embezzlement charges were dropped. He had also said if he owed anything, he would have paid it. But eventually, he, after appeal, was convicted and sentenced to 12 months for fraudulent conversion at that particular time. E.P. McCarran had won his personal battle with James Lawless. It didn't last for very long because Sean T. O'Kelly sacked him in 1936 for disobeying an instruction that O'Kelly, who was then Minister for Local Government, had given. In 1930, the new Local Government Dublin Act changed everything. Balrodary Rural District Council was abolished. Rathmines and Pembroke moved to Dublin Corporation, and Dún Laoghaire Borough Council was set up, but it was set up as a subsidiary of Dublin County Council. So yet again, the wealthy South County coastal suburbs of Dublin had representation on Dublin County Council, which would have negated any influence of the farmers of North County Dublin. And the only other place there was farmers in County Dublin was actually in and around Tallaght and Clondalkin. And Tallaght and Clondalkin actually was always lumped in with North County Dublin around that time. In those elections, the council split 12-12. On one side, you had the ratepayers, you had the farmers' representatives and government supporters. On the other side, you had a couple of independents, one of whom was PJ Fogarty, and you had Labour and Fianna Fáil. PJ Curran was returned. Joseph O'Neill was used his casting vote as chairman before he left to ensure that all of the positions, chairman, vice chairman, various positions on committees, were taken by government supporters. Henry McCormack, a Labour representative from Malahide, was elected. Paddy Belton was returned. PJ Fogarty, Henry Dardis from Skerries, again a government supporter. Thomas Ennis. The Ennis family had been involved in the 1870s and 1880s as poor law guardians from up around the area of the Knoll. And James Tunney was returned for Fianna Fáil. Later defected or moved to Labour. He's the father of James Tunney, who was later a government minister. So we have looked through a very, very difficult period in the 1920s, when effectively the legacy of the second decade was being paid for, and being paid for by, in Fingal, the ordinary people, the workers, and indeed the farmers. After the revolutionary period, the new normality, as I said, was one of economic stagnation and poverty. Things that were being put in place, like electrification, hadn't got to Fingal at that stage. People had seen a whole succession of elections and they were fed up with them. The two posters there are posters from the 1932 election. Maybe if Fingal County Council are interested, I'll come back and talk about the 1930s next year. But what the 1920s is the end of is what I would sort of say the powerful period in local government. It was through local government, through the boards of guardians, that nationalists first learned how to govern in Ireland. There was a glass ceiling. They couldn't get up in national government until much later. But that's Balrodary Board of Guardians, Dublin County Council, Balrodary Rural District Council, where there was a local voice and there was a local person who was representing them. For a lot of people, local government was their connection, because Dublin Castle wasn't a connection. Westminster wasn't a connection. Parnell Street or Parnell Square was. The workhouse, the Board of Guardians boardroom in Balrodary was. And it meant something to people and they felt they were being heard. The 1920s was when local government became almost, as it later did, a mirror of national government. It split on national party basis. So we might think not a lot happened in the 1920s, but the 1920s are very, very important in terms of being a watershed for local government, but also probably one of the most difficult decades that the people of Fingal might have faced. Thank you.